Fosi Audio have truly outdone themselves this time, beating their own personal record of 5 knobs on a single device. What will they think of next? At around $40 US, this is the most competitive product in their entire range, and simply put, it is a 5-channel headphone amplifier. But who's it for? Surprisingly, there are actually quite a number of reasonably logical applications for this kind of device. Band practice, studio work, classroom work, podcast monitoring, and so on. It can also be used as a preamp for things like turntables, but we all know the real reason this thing exists: for headphone reviewers. What is simultaneously the number one problem and request from members of the audio community to reviewers? Headphone comparisons. As if it wasn't hard enough already getting questions like, how does it compare with the special edition headphone from 2005 with Mr. Modder's ear bleeder kit? We can now at least take a small sigh of relief and compare multiple headphones at once without having to constantly plug them in and out of our painfully inferior single-socketed amps while pausing the music. At least until the audiophiles grab their pitchforks and ask us how they sound on different amps. Included with the PH05 is a single 3.5mm synthetic fabric-sheathed auxiliary cable and a small 12-volt power supply cable. At this price point, the build quality is exceptional. The finish of the metal is at the same high standard I've come to expect from products like the SK01 and SK02, and every single potentiometer has very smooth action and good resistance. This is useful as it helps prevent accidentally adjusting the other controls, which is entirely possible as there is not much real estate, especially between the master volume control and the third channel, which appears to be the only significant design oversight. The master volume knob, while it governs the volume of all 5 channels at once, can also be thought of as a maximum volume limiter, and would also be useful for some instances where various media or different sources are being used, as volumes can vary between different media. The multifunctional button doesn't feel like a weak point necessarily, but it doesn't instill as much confidence as the rest of the build. With a very shallow and soft actuation, a single press mutes and unmutes the device. An orange LED indicates power, and a blue LED indicates the device is muted. Holding the button down for 1 second will turn the PH05 on and off. On the back of the PH05 is a single 12-volt power socket, and on the bottom are 4 Fosi Audio branded rubber feet. These feet are stickers and also hide the assembly screws. On the front there are 6 3.5mm ports. The slightly more lonely one on the left is the auxiliary input. Then the rest correspond to each headphone output. As expected, they appear in the correct order from left to right, corresponding to each individual channel controlled by the 5 smaller knobs. As a side note, I wasn't too happy about the lack of an input on the back of the unit. In some cases, I would imagine that keeping the front clear for only inputs would have been more user-friendly. For some users or situations, I also think the inclusion of some color coding or a more visible label, at least for the input, would have been a good quality of life improvement. At least the provided auxiliary cable is thin enough to be run underneath the unit for a slightly cleaner desktop situation. To get the most important thing out of the way first, this amplifier does not impart any particular color or character of its own onto the headphone. Here is a graph of a Sennheiser HD650 measured in exactly the same position. One graph is measured with the Fosi Audio SK02, which I have previously reviewed and shown to be basically neutral. The second graph is from the SK02's auxiliary output to the PH05 input. As you can see, there is no difference in the sound. The graphs overlay perfectly. The next big sound test I performed pushed it to its extreme limits. For this test, I took 5 vastly different headphones. First, I plugged in my JVC HAFW1800 IEM, which is extremely sensitive. Next, a Sony MDR-E868 earbud, which is also quite sensitive. Then going into more realistic studio territory, a Sony MDR V6. Next, a Sennheiser HD650, and finally a highly insensitive vintage AKG K240DF. The aim of this test was to see if the PH05 could handle extreme variety between different channels at the same time. The good news is that with the HAFW1800 turned down very low and the K240DF turned up very high, not only did the PH05 manage to run both without any significant audible problems, the master volume could still provide some relatively useful volume changes across all headphones despite the wildly different sensitivities. It has to be said though that with very sensitive IEMs like the HAFW1800, you will almost certainly hear some background humming or hissing. With all other headphones, including the flathead earbuds, I heard no audible background noise unless I pushed the more sensitive ones near the highest volumes. But at that volume I didn't even have any music running, as that would have destroyed my ears. So, unfortunately, while I can't recommend these as a tool for IEM reviewers, they perform competently, even for some of the more difficult vintage studio monitor headphones. As a side note, I also can't fully recommend using this for difficult to drive headphones such as the K240DF and large planars, as it only outputs 310 milliwatts per channel. For most small studios and podcasters who will most likely be using the usual suspects from Sony, Biodynamic and AKG, the PH05 will have no problem driving any of them to more than adequate volumes while providing a perceived black background. Also, it needs to be mentioned that the master volume control will still raise the volume of sensitive IEMs faster than insensitive vintage studio headphones. So in my opinion, the best use cases for this unit involves using only headphones of a similar type. For anyone who is seriously thinking about getting into podcasting, or needs a cheap versatile headphone amp for band practice or group work, there are actually very few options with 5 outputs and a master control, which is quite a rare feature at any price point for this type of device. Of course, there is no live level monitoring of the channels and no individual mute switches, but at this price, as a simple tool, there is very little to complain about. Anyone into headphone reviewing might not immediately see the appeal of such a relatively low-end device compared to high-end amps. But once again, as a tool, I've already found that it surpasses my expectations for being able to help me very quickly compare 2 or more headphones at once. Since it does not have a very strong output and does not present a perfectly black background, I still can't recommend it for critical listening, but that was also never its purpose to begin with. The PH05 gets a thumbs up from me. It fulfills my expectations without being an eyesore on the desk. Take it easy, and I'll see you in the next one.